Namaskar, I'm Ashok Vyas. You're watching Vision of Asia, a voice of the community on ITV Gold. This Sunday, it's a very special Sunday. There are multiple transitions happening in the world, in our society, and we will be also sharing some of the stories related to these major two transitions that are becoming a part of our experience. Post COVID-19, we are in the process of reopening, and at the same time, the killing of George Floyd and protest in the aftermath of that brutal attack has resulted into resurgence of a sort for Black Lives Matter movement. And there are some anti-social elements taking advantage of this situation and indulging into looting that has also become a cause of concern. So all this at the backdrop of today's Vision of Asia. As we share the main stories of this edition, we'll have Newsome's address to South Asian community about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement. We'll hear from Annetta Seecharran of Chhaya CDC community talking about justice, and Dr. Rishi Chopra will give us update on coronavirus. Council member Donovan Richards also joined us and talked about his response to this recent killing of a black man by police. We'll hear from Assemblyman Mukerji in today's show, and also we'll have a special weekly segment this week with Padma Shri Dr. Sudhir Parikh. So all this coming up, stay with us. We'll be right back after these short messages. You're watching Vision of Asia, Voice of Community, and today we begin with part of the address by Newsome. She addressed South Asian community, theme George Floyd's killing and Black Lives Matter movement in New York City. Take a look.
Chivona, Newsome, thank you so much for being with us on ITV Gold. You are representing Black Lives Matter, Greater New York chapter, as well as you're running for Congress. Thank you so much for being with us here on ITV Gold. I hope you're well.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a long time since the Women's March. We're under a lot of pressure, me and the organization, as we're fighting for liberation, but I'm happy to be here and share the message with you. Thank you for having me.
Definitely. Let's dig right into it. There is so much happening in the country right now. Communities are outraged. We have seen thousands and thousands of people go and protest. We've also seen riots and other demonstrations. My question to you is, since Black Lives Matter is such a center organization for this movement, what are you demanding in terms of justice for Floyd? And in terms of what the Black Lives Matter movement exactly wants, how do we bring forth this justice?
Well, in the justice for Mr. George Floyd, we are demanding all the officers be prosecuted. We just received word that all three will be charged. I know one officer is already in custody. I was actually on the site of where Mr. Floyd lost his life when I found out about the first set of charges and the first arrest. In terms of justice, We don't want this to happen again. It reminds the world of what happened with Eric Garner 5 years ago. So we want legislation in place. We're calling on all governors to enact an executive order for the I Can't Breathe Act, which if you're crying out while you're in police custody for medical attention and the officers fail to do so, that's a Class A felony. Now, if you die in their custody, as we've seen with Eric Garner, as we've seen with Mr. George Floyd, that's an automatic murder charge. And this is what we want all 50 states to enact, the I Can't Breathe Act.
What did you say? What did you have to say about the announcement that all 4 officers have been arrested, and there are charges being filed on them? Is that somewhat of a resolution, or does the fight continue?
That's not a resolution. That's a step in the right direction. Now, all 4 officers being arrested, that all came from the people. If people wouldn't have taken to the streets, used their constitutional rights to assemble and voice their opinion and use their voice, this would not have happened. If people continue to apply pressure to the United States government on every single level, then we will have a real resolution, because nothing happens for marginalized people, specifically Black people, unless laws are in place. I would not have the right to vote. As you mentioned, I would not have the right to run for Congress here in the Bronx. So we need concrete legislation. Just arresting those officers, that's a quick fix. No, we're in it for the long haul. We want true justice.
Definitely. In terms of justice, I want to talk to you about what has happened in the nation. And if you can give us some more insight into what the true story is. You were on the ground in Minneapolis. You've been on the ground here in New York. My question to you is, could you describe what is happening here in terms of these protests? And what are your comments to the people that are rioting or are looting and do not represent the majority of protesters?
I'm happy that your organization, your outlet, is acknowledging that the majority of people protesting are demonstrating, that they're expressing their voices, they're getting their political message out, and that message is police reform. That message is justice for George Floyd. And so the looters, I understand their pain. I understand their frustration. We have to look at who the looters are. Now, looters are typically people who are low income, as we've seen here in the Bronx and in the areas that it's happened. It's people who have been oppressed by the United States government for generations. Slavery began in this country over 400 years ago. And it's sad that the focus has been more on the looting and the damage of property than what's truly occurred, the murder of a man in police custody. Now, in terms of the sad thing that's really made me outraged is America tends to care more about property than it does about people. We see peaceful protesters being attacked by current law enforcement agencies. America has always cared about property. If you think about our founding doctrines, it was life, liberty, and property, and later became the pursuit of happiness. So until the world started seeing buildings burning and stores being looted, that's what's giving people a direct response. I do not encourage or condone violence. I do not encourage people to break up and destroy their own neighborhoods. But unfortunately, this kind of pressure has garnered political results.
I'd like to discuss here the term internalized racism, as well as anti-Blackness. And I say it in order to educate the South Asian viewers of ITV Gold, as well as the Indo-Caribbean viewers. Could you explain what that term exactly means for the Black community and how much it has relevance into what's playing today?
What I would like to answer your question and talk about systemic oppression. That is the root of this anti-Blackness. Black people were not considered as people here in America. As you see, we see the Black people have been colonized around the world. We've seen it in Africa. We've seen it anywhere where people who look like me live. Systemic oppression stops Black people from advancing. Our school systems are poor. It's hard for us to get a job. There were mass incarceration bills. So there was always this system in place to keep Black people down. Black business owners, as you've seen during the COVID crisis, have been denied loans. So it seems that people hate Black people simply because of the color of their skin. Unfortunately, law enforcement, you have to think about the history of law enforcement, and then you can understand why this behavior continues. Original law enforcement and police were used to capture slaves under the Fugitive Slave Act. So they would capture people who look like me and return them to slave plantations. And that feeling and that sentiment within police departments has not gone anywhere, no matter how many laws are put in place. That's why we now need laws to protect Black people from the police department.
Moving towards another story in today's Vision of Asia, a voice of the community with the address of Chhaya CDC is Annetta Seecharran. She is passionately involved in important social causes, and how Chhaya CDC is joining hands in raising the much needed voice. Here are some highlights from her address.
Today, I think we're finally acknowledging that the vast majority of the protests that have occurred across the country, including here in New York City, have been peaceful. The news, as news tends to focus on the sort of hotspots, the violence. But the vast majority of the protests have been peaceful. And I would say that the protests are justified. The anger felt by the Black community and communities of colors and other communities is absolutely justified. The horrific murder of George Floyd, I don't know how anybody could watch that and not become personally enraged by that brutality, by the sort of absolute lack of humanity and that the officer engaged in keeping his knee on a human being and cutting off the air supply for 7 minutes or so. I don't know how anybody, if you have a heart, couldn't be enraged by that. So I would say that the protest, the outburst, the anger is absolutely justified. And I think that it's time for change. I think I would just comment on the violence and the looting. I think we know now that much of that is instigated, and it is not coming from the very well-intentioned protesters. It is instigated, it's stoked, and it's meant to dismiss and the validity of the protest. And I hope that as our community sort of takes in what's happening across the country, that we don't lose sight of what's really important here, that it is time for change. For too long, Blacks and other communities of colors, including immigrants, have been left out of freedoms and opportunities that whites have enjoyed in this country. And this country is our country too.
In your statement on this incident, you called upon certain changes, and you also reflected upon the actions we could take as a community, especially South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans. I would like for you to share that.
We shared 3 actions, a petition and other actions. I think but we really want to emphasize that for everyone, not everybody's going to be able to donate to causes that are leading the charge in drawing attention to the systemic racism and long injustices that Blacks have felt in this country. But what we really want to leave our community with is that check yourself, check your family members. Let's hold each other accountable to how we promote anti-Blackness in this country. And even if you don't really, you're not there yet where you can feel the empathy, but it does actually come right back to us as a community. We are also, in many respects and in many spaces, considered outsiders, not welcomed, and experience immense racism.
Definitely. Right now, I'd like to now, talk to you about COVID-19, because we cannot forget that we are in a pandemic while the country is outraged right now. There are a lot of issues that Chhaya is strongly fighting for, especially in order to relieve the economic ramifications as well as the healthcare impact of COVID-19. I'd like to reflect upon the issues of housing policy amidst COVID-19. Could you reflect on what exactly are you fighting for and what is needed in terms of these economic ramifications when we're looking at housing or we're looking at taxes?
It's important for us to first start by acknowledging that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted people of color in New York City and across the country. And the community that's been most impacted have been Blacks. If we look at the community that Chhaya cares about, which is low to moderate income South Asians and Indo-Caribbeans, that community has also been deeply, deeply impacted. And as many have already stated, there are preconditions that determine how the disease has played out in various communities.
You're watching Vision of Asia, Voice of Community. This program comes to you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 8 p.m. And we bring a very special weekly edition of Vision of Asia every Sunday at 11 a.m. That is where we are meeting right now. Thanks for joining us. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. In conversation with Aditi Lamba for ITV Gold, Dr. Rishi Chopra talks to us about coronavirus updates, measures, and social distancing in New York City. All these are relevant themes of the day. Here are some excerpts from that conversation.
Yeah, New York City has been the epicenter of this COVID pandemic, not just for the United States, it's for the world. I think that I looked at the statistics, I think, a couple of days ago, and we comprise 1/4 of all deaths in the United States. So it's a very sobering statistic. And I'm a dermatology resident. I primarily treat the skin. My specialty isn't in the ICU. However, before we become dermatologists, we do 1 year of general medicine training after medical school. And luckily, I spent 2 weeks training in the ICU, so I had that background under me to help me through this process. As a physician in New York City, there was a shortage of doctors during the height of the pandemic. My sister, as I said, is an ICU resident in Long Island. Her husband is an emergency medicine physician in Manhattan. And my dad is an urgent care physician in Queens. So all of us were on the front lines at the same time. They obviously were dealing from things from day one until the spike and then afterwards. I was called in much later as a reinforcement because they just didn't have enough general medicine physicians to deal with this pandemic. So my hospital had asked for volunteers because we didn't have the manpower to deal with all the new cases that were coming in.
Right.
And, I felt I was born and raised in New York. I went into medicine to help people. My whole family is on the front lines. It wasn't a choice for me. It was a responsibility to really help out in any way that I could. And so it was, essentially what happened was we converted our pediatrics unit in the hospital into a COVID unit. And I was working along pediatricians, ophthalmologists, radiologists, doctors that haven't seen general medicine in a really long time or not familiar with it. And it was terrifying, but it was also extremely rewarding for us to all come in together and help out for a common cause. It was really, no one had ever expected it, and it was something that it changed you. You go in every day, you didn't know if you were going to get sick. You didn't know if there was going to be PPE. You didn't know how your patients were going to do after you left them overnight, the last night. There weren't enough resources for patients just because we're dealing with a pandemic and our hospital only has a limited amount of resources. It was definitely a experience I'll never forget. Just to talk about getting sick while treating patients, it's a very real thing. My family was heavily affected by COVID. My sister contracted COVID while treating patients. My dad contracted COVID while treating patients. And it was, for my sister, luckily there were milder symptoms. For my dad, who was much older, it was, we forced my mom to leave the house while me and my sister were deployed and moved in with my father to help him currently to make sure that we could do everything possible so that he didn't have to go to the hospital. And my dad's a trooper. Since day one, he was treating COVID patients. Even when he got sick, he would just treat COVID patients from home.
Wow.
Via telemedicine. And as soon as he got better, as soon as his symptoms resolved and he was out of that kind of infectious period, he just went straight back to work.
Wow.
So everybody was just kind of all hands on deck at the time. We didn't know if this pandemic was ever going to subside. It was during the peak. We weren't flattening the curve at that point. We didn't know how bad it was going to get. No one had anticipated that it was going to get this bad ever. Looking back on it, even in early March, my sister, her husband, me, I never thought that I would ever be deployed. And then once we were deployed, we just didn't know when it was ever going to end, if it was going to end. So it was, I can't even put that experience into words. But to watch my colleagues and the other healthcare workers in the hospital, everybody go through this together and just help out for a common cause. It's been one of the most rewarding experiences, in not just a medical professional, but as a New Yorker. So it was intense, but luckily we are out of that, and hopefully if we do have another spike, it will be much more manageable.
What is the current status of PPE and other supplies that you need in the hospital? And in terms of just reflecting upon all that has happened, Doctor, what are some of these uncertainties that are still not being solved, and some of your concerns for the next few weeks?
So I think when it comes to PPE, we've had great success with donations from the community. At the height of the pandemic, we were using anything for PPE. My brother-in-law was using garbage bags. I luckily had no real issues at my particular institution with PPE. Actually, that's not true. When I first was deployed, we ran out of gowns. And so that was a real big issue, especially because when you go into a room, you have to change. Normally, under normal circumstances, you have to take the gown off every time you go in and out, and you have so many workers going in and out. Immediately, nobody had anticipated a pandemic, you would run out of gowns. So that was a real big issue.
Council member Richard Donovan talked to us with President of India Home Mukund Mehta about the issue of response to George Floyd's killing. How protesters which are peacefully protesting, their cause is being hijacked by looters is a concern of council member. Here are some parts of that conversation.
De-escalation training has been happening. The NYPD, like many departments, spends a lot of money on de-escalation training. And quite frankly, in Minnesota, one of the things they have over New York City, they're actually more transparent even around reporting mechanisms that they have, right? So this is a department that actually reports on chokeholds. And I think I heard today that 3/5 of all chokeholds used in that city, although the Black community makes up very little, were of Black people, right? Black and brown people. I always try to put myself in individual shoes. I try to look at it from the standpoint and try to take a fair approach. And when you look at that specific incident, just like Eric Garner, where you had a police officer kneeling on this man's neck with his knee for nearly 9 minutes, and him saying he can't breathe, calling out for his mom. I mean, there's no training that could fix that issue. That's called being a human being. If racism is embedded in some individuals, they'll treat people that way. And I believe that there certainly was some bias there. And there was clearly a reason why this officer felt he can do that. And part of it is he knew he could get away with it. He thought he could get away with it. And that's the problem rooted in law enforcement, is that we see these situations over and over. They transpire over and over again. But the problem is that even as that happens, there are no repercussions for those actions, for their actions. So accountability and transparency are two things that have to be central in moving this country forward and making sure that we really build bridges with law enforcement.
So law is there, and I want to understand, Mukunji, do you agree when council member says that he feels that the officer that he can get away with it? Why should that impression be a part of their psyche?
I think, as Mr. Richards said about the accountability and the transparency, I fully agree with that one, because in New York, unless and until Section 50A of New York City civil rights law is changed, they are provided a little bit shield to the police officers. And regarding the transparency, I think there is a somewhat of they are given what you call it qualified immunity. That also protects the police officers. So I think there are some differences between the laws here and in other states. So unless and until, as Mr. Richard said, that accountability and the transparency are not improved, this situation may again repeat. And this is what happened even in the past in the big riots that took place, I think 1964 Watts riots. And also another thing was in 1992 when the verdict came out after the case. So I think unless and until some laws are changed, a protection of police officers should be rather modified.
If there is something which results into a kind of immunity for police officers, is that necessary? I mean, we need to find a balance. So based on your knowledge, and since you have closely worked on these issues as chair of the House of Public Safety.
Well, absolutely. And Mr. Mehta hit it right on the head. 50A, which is the state law that shields NYPD officers from public scrutiny. So right now in New York State, and this is one of the only states where police officers can hide their disciplinary records. So we all have a right to know who's policing our communities. So if there's an officer out there who's engaging in police brutality, the public should have a right to know. The media should have a right to know. And unfortunately, in New York State, we don't know because the state law has largely shielded them from scrutiny. So I was very happy to hear Governor Cuomo come out in support of repealing 50A and saying that the state legislature should certainly come up with the bill and send it his way so he could sign it into law. That's going to make a big difference. And then, today I talked about just briefly about my bill, which is to mandate the police commissioner to come up with something called a discipline matrix. Now, even in high school, right, Mr. Mehta, if I got in trouble, you got in trouble, you knew what your discipline was going to be. If you got into a fight, you knew that the principal could send you and suspend you for 5 days. In the NYPD, there's no criteria, there's no guidelines. Think about this. So if you go out there and you hit somebody upside the head or you ram your car into protesters, there's no disciplinary measures that are set for those officers. So today the speaker of the city council came out in support of my bill, including a bill sponsored by Rory Lansman, which would ban chokeholds that can be applied to people's necks, which we've seen in these cases kill people. So certainly there are things that the state and the city have to do better, and it all starts with transparency and ensuring that officers know that they're not above the law, that we all have to adhere to one law, and no one, whether you're in law enforcement or not, are above it.
So no one is above the law is very, what should I say, the basis for proper functioning of any civilized society. And indeed, protesting is also a part of one's democratic right. But how protests are designed makes a lot of difference, which affects innocent people as well as it affects the cause for which the protests are undertaken. So there are two sides to the situation where we are in right now. One, I would like both of you to look at it from the short-term uh, perspective, and one another, of course, is long-term. So we will talk about both, council member. But going towards the short-term for now, the way protests have escalated, in spite of the need to impose curfew after 11 p.m., whether it was in DC or whether it was in New York last night, we have seen the kind of looting that I don't remember having heard of in any other period in America, whether it is the flagship of Macy's in Manhattan or Nike or other stores. And Mukunji, what do you make out of it in the name of protest?
Uh,
Yeah.
Ashok, what I believe is that here there is a balancing is to be done between the constitutional independence or constitutional liberty versus protection of police and the public lives. So even the proper balancing is not done and is lopsided, then such a situation arises. When the mob, uh, some people who come from outside the state, and according to the figures of those arrested, 1 out of 7 is a non-New Yorker. 15% of the people who have been arrested, they come from outside. So when they pelt the rocks and the bottles, then naturally police has to respond by having tear gas and batons and projectiles, such thing, paper spray, etc. So when there is a direct attack on the police, naturally they will enforce their power to a greater degree than what has been shown by the protesters.
Is governor expressing his disagreement about the handling of law and order situation by mayor, saying that mayor underestimates the scope of problem, and mayor has consistently denied the call for bringing in national guards. What do you have to say about these two things?
Well, I think we have to separate out the two things, and let's not get the message lost that there are a lot of peaceful protests happening around the city. And let me just remind people, anytime these situations arise, and this is not the first time, there are opportunists out there, and they're wrong. Because what happens is when you go out and loot, you discredit what we're marching for. I don't agree with people throwing Molotov cocktails at police officers. That is horrendous. That's not the way we meet our objective, as Brother Gandhi has taught us as well, in really reaching the goals that we're trying to do. So the two things we have to be focused on, or what does the budget of the city of New York look like, and what are our priorities in that budget? And then two, we have to be focused on policies and reforms. And there's a role for marching. Marching plays a role. The Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act came into light because people marched, people died. So those who loot are doing a disservice to everything that we are fighting for, and they should be held accountable. I would urge those who are doing it that we are out here marching for you and your children to make sure that your lives are better. And then you also have some factions of a lot of white anarchists who are out there setting the fires. Let's just call it what it is. It's not black folks setting the fires. It's white anarchists. And they have their own agenda. That's not our agenda. Our agenda is to ensure that we get the reforms and that we produce that righteous anger, because we do have a right to be angry, but we don't have a right. And those who are out there looting, they're doing a disservice to everything that we're fighting for. But I'll say this again, you will find opportunists in any situation, whether it's marching, whether it's politics, whether it's sports. Opportunism is something that's breeded in some individuals' DNA. They take advantage of situations. There's looting on Wall Street too. Let's remind people, they may not be burning down the streets, but they're certainly burning down everyday Americans' opportunities out of greed. So there's looting going on. It's just legal looting. So the thing is we have to ensure that we send that strong message to those who would be out there looting and doing a disservice to everything that we're trying to fight for during this moment.
So what argument council member has shared has its own validity, yet it doesn't give any sense of assurance to a common New Yorker that he would walk home safely if situations go out of hand. So while on any level we are in a position to justify the kind of unruly behavior, but the other point is also valid, where we take into account the situation in its totality. So Mukunji, as I was mentioning, there are two sides to it. One is short term. So in short term, when you have president talking about looting and shooting in the same phrase, it sends a message. And if you put that message with what we just heard from council member, it creates a volatile situation. So I'll have his comment, but before that, where lies the possible peaceful road ahead? And allow me to add, there we have seen many police officers showing their solidarity with people who are protesting. There are multiple images where you see them kneeling down and sometimes walking also with the protesters and saying that this is a parade. And so there have been very nice gestures on the part of police officers also. Yeah.
Oh, okay, you are very right that when the police acts in harmony with the protesters, the result is totally different. For example, in 2015, when the Freddie Gray's case came up, there was a somewhat of a reconciliatory tone by the police department, as against in 2014 in that Ferguson, Missouri case of Michael Brown. There was a completely different, because that was of a something of a combative type approach taken by the police. So when the police acts as if they are a part of the society and not something beyond the society.
Assembly member Raj Mukerji represents 33rd Legislative District. He is passionately involved and committed to bring the community together. And this dynamic young leader talked to us about justice for George Floyd and the importance of South Asian voice in all this spectrum.
Over 20 states have a curfew going on right now due to these demonstrations that have gone really violent. You have, the president also saying that he's going to deploy the National Guard. My question to you is, as a father and as a South Asian, how do we address this to our kids? And also, how do we address it to the youth that is, living in this country and they're growing up here and they are, the minority community? How do we, have this conversation right now?
Yeah. So, as South Asian Americans, I think we can always draw inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi and from Dr. King. And on the one hand, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it's an adage that we must instill in our children. And we also have to ensure that they understand that peaceful civil protest is the way in which we will eventually achieve these ends. What's happening, what we're seeing in terms of the violence and the looting, that is not widespread. These are fringe elements. And this is a discrete minority of folks. And they're not protesters, right? These are opportunists. These are folks that would be committed to violence anyway. Robbing stores is doing nothing for Mr. Floyd's memory. So these are fringe elements. They're trying to distract from the issues that are actually at hand, that the vast majority of protesters are committed to seeing through. in a peaceful act of protest. And I think President Obama and First Lady Obama have spoken very eloquently about that topic. And I think we just have to keep our eye on the prize and not be distracted by fringe elements that are committing criminal acts, because they're not the real protesters and they don't represent the vast majority of protesters.
Right. And this entire process has definitely bring up, the conversation of systemic racism, which exists in the nation, and, its interaction with police brutality, another topic that we all talk about. My question to you is, as somebody who works on legislation a lot, what is needed out of the law right now in order to get some peace, in order to get some answers to what is happening and how can we really combat it? Right now we're talking about these protests. My question to you is, what after these protests? What do we really need in our system?
I don't think legislation is going to be enough. That doesn't mean that policies that ensure blacks and browns are locked up disproportionately for offenses that are committed at a similar rate by their white counterparts should be the order of the day. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at our criminal justice system to ensure that any imbalance is corrected. That doesn't mean that the laws and the policies that promote systemic racism or that we can't deal with and escalate the gradation of how we treat bias crimes in different states, which we've done, I think, a good job of in New Jersey.
Right.
All that's true. But we're not going to be able to legislate away hate. We're not going to be able to legislate away racism. We're not going to be able to legislate what's in people's hearts. What's in people's hearts, what's in people's minds. The idea that we have taken racism, discrimination, biases, prejudices that were previously, I think, really thought of as being on the fringe,
Right.
made it more okay to be in the mainstream and to talk openly on social media or otherwise about these horrific views that people have. This hatred coming out into the open, that is very distressing. And there's a lot of damage that I think we need to repair in our country. There's polarization. We see that in our politics. We see that at our dinner tables. And I think that that can't be legislated away. For us to heal as a nation, we're going to have to understand each other's perspectives. We're going to have to understand the experience of young Black Americans growing up in this country. And we're going to have to, I think, to heal as a nation, we're really going to have to look at the soul of our country and think about what it means. Think about the responsibility that all of us have in shaping our future. It's a very difficult time.
Yeah.
Hello, dear friends. I am Padma Shri Dr. Sudhir Parikh, Chairman of Parikh Wholeware Media and ITV Gold. Would like to say with heavy heart that a legendary community leader, my very good friend, family friend, Mr. Ramesh Patel, is not with us anymore. Incidentally, I saw him on FaceTime few hours before this sad news came. He was a friend of the whole Indian American community. He was a legend. He was a true community leader, a selfless leader. He's the chairman of Federation of Indian Association of New York, New Jersey, and Karnataka. He was born on April 28, 1942. His birth year was coincided with the Quit India movement in India. His love and dedication for Bharat guided him to unite community under one umbrella or banner of Federation of Indian Association. Ramesh Patel showed his love for India and Indian community by founding India Day Parade in USA 50 years ago. And this year was a golden jubilee of India Day Parade. Ramesh Patel left us for heavenly abode on 6 June 2020. This is another great loss for the community due to this coronavirus pandemic. A legendary father figure is not with us anymore, but his spirit will continue to guide us. We are together with Patel family at this challenging time. We pray for strength to Patel family and our prayers for liberation of Ramesh Bhai. Ramesh Bhai, you will be deeply missed. My sincere and deepest condolences to all the family members of Mr. Ramesh Patel. From ITV Gold, Parikh Worldwide Media, and my wife Sudha, and my son and daughter Urvi and Ravi. And our prayers are with the family member of Ramesh Patel. Om Santi, Santi, Santi.
And now time to say goodbye from today's Vision of Asia Voice of Community. But before we say goodbye, once again time to recollect that we wish each and every one of you well. Take care, stay safe, and indeed do join us on our Facebook page, Become Our Friends. That is a very vibrant ITV Gold Facebook page. Also subscribe to ITV Gold YouTube channel and keep writing to us events@itvgold.com. We appreciate your continued encouraging support and love. And on that note, time to say goodbye from today's Vision of Asia Voice of Community. This is Ashok Vyas. Namaste.